President Eisenhower said that in his family, they always had to read through the Bible every so often completely, but they were given permission to skip the genealogies. And you can understand why. I want you to know that I gave Anne the opportunity to skip the genealogy, to not be a reader, but she bravely said she would go ahead and do it. It's an amazing thing to think that she would volunteer, and secondly, that people would actually want to read this stuff. Because what it is really is a walk through the family graveyard of Jesus. And it can be awesome. It's not morbid. Some people think, that going to a cemetery is morbid. It doesn't have to be that way. At least it's not that way to me. I think everybody should walk through a cemetery regularly. I was down at the Ottawa Park 2 weeks ago. I laid a wreath on my in-law's grave, and I looked around at the other family members around there, and it wasn't morbid at all. And, I think it's a good thing to do on your birthday. Just go and spend 1 hour in any cemetery on your birthday and just walk around. You will be amazed at the amount of clarity that will come into your mind if you walk around a cemetery and you think about life and about death. It'll not only bring clarity about your life, but it'll also help you to rearrange priorities and what's important. So I commend it to you. I like to walk through cemeteries. I like to walk through because, it's good for a guy like me to spend some time among my own generation. And cemeteries, they can be very inspiring. I have been to Arlington National Cemetery several times, and I assure you there's nothing morbid about it. You stand there and you look over those rows and rows of white crosses and stars of David, and you cannot but help be moved by what you see. You just go down Central Avenue here, all the way down to Jackman to Woodlawn Cemetery, and you can see the graves of people like Tidkey and Secor and Reynolds and Stranahan and Morrison R. Waite, which is kind of important to me because our school was named after that Supreme Court justice. Some of you have seen these graves. It's hard to catch up all the feelings that you have when you go. Although sometimes it can be embarrassing because, you can come across graves of folks that you wish you weren't related to. So far as we know, on my father's side, my grandfather's side, we can trace our lineage back to the 16th century neighborhood in Paris, France, a neighborhood not too far from the Louvre called DeShetler. According to the work my aunt did, our side of the family came to this country, that is the father's side came down through Canada. Well, a little while ago, I got an email from my cousin Pat in Texas. My cousin was very excited because she discovered, with the help of a professional genealogist, that our family on the grandmother's side might be connected to some of the founding colonists of Canada. In fact, she sent me a copy, a certificate, indicating that she was now a member of the King's Daughters, or the Filles de le Roi of the 17th century. She's so proud, and she's so happy. And she wanted all of us, me, my kids, the grandkids, to go get our DNA swabs and have them verified so as to verify the connection. Being able to trace your lineage back to the King's Daughters is like tracing your lineage back to the people who came over on the Mayflower, or finding evidence that you could belong to the Daughters of the American Revolution. Our family was part of the founding fathers and mothers of New France, or Canada. Now, so far I haven't acted on her requests because I'm pretty sure that we're going to discover that the DeShetler family's got some rather sordid past. On my grandfather's side, I know who they were. They were muskrat hunters and rum runners that came down through Canada and Michigan, and they stopped at Toledo. I Googled the King's Daughters, and sure enough, I found out that Louis XIV recruited 800 women from 1663 to 1673 to go to Canada because all that was in Canada were soldiers and fur trappers and priests. And they needed women to marry these men, not the priests, but the other men, and populate Canada. So the king paid their way to come to Canada, gave them a dowry, and indeed the plan worked. 770 of these 800 women married, and in 10 short years, the population of Canada doubled. Canada would become a viable colony. But, there's always a but. I read that some of the women may have been orphans looking for a home, that many, if not most, were probably illiterate. And someone back there started the rumor that they were prostitutes, that hoped by coming to this country they would be absolved of their sins. So no, I'm not simply related to muskrat hunters and rum runners. On my grandfather's side, I'm potentially related to orphaned women who were illiterate and of questionable moral character. A walk through my cemetery isn't exactly a picnic, Going through cemeteries can be a strange and mysterious thing. South of Atlanta, there's a small town, and there's a very large family, and all the family members are buried together in one large plot, except for one person. By the inscription on the marker, he's a son, but he's buried about 50 yards away, all by himself. Try to think of the family dynamics that might be behind that relationship and that funeral. It breaks one's heart to think about it, but graveyards, they can be strange places, mysterious places, embarrassing places, and inspiring places. Today, what we do is go through the cemetery that holds the remains of the family of Jesus. It's a rather extensive list, and it would be, to any Jewish reader, a very impressive list. Jews were extremely, and are extremely interested in genealogy, and in the Old Testament, you're going to find a great many lists, genealogies of famous people. In fact, the Jews put the greatest possible store in the purity of one's lineage. If a man had the slightest portion of foreign blood, he might lose his right to be called a Jew, a member of the family of God. It's a pretty impressive thing that Jesus can trace his lineage all the way back to Abraham. Now, at first glance, there's nothing terribly unusual about the people in Jesus' cemetery. It's a little bit odd the way that Matthew arranges the gravestones in the cemetery. He's got 3 rows of 14 in each row. And you're probably wondering, why does Matthew do that? Well, Matthew is an extremely clever and brilliant writer, and you wouldn't know this, at least I wouldn't think you would, that in Hebrew they have no numbers. The letters of the alphabet serve as numbers. So Aleph, the first letter, is number 1, and Beth is number 2, and Gimel is number 3, and Daleth is number 4, and so on through the alphabet. It's just like a children's code that they used to make up when you were little, But anyhow, and there are no vowels in the Hebrew language. So David's name is spelled DVD. But if you attach the number instead of the name, you get 4 plus 6 plus 4, a total of 14. And so what David is, or rather what Matthew's trying to say is, folks, you might think this Jesus coming was haphazard, that it was all kind of coincidental, but no. Every marking point that was important, from Abraham to David, from David to the exile, from the exile to the Messiah, is 14 generations. This is all well thought out, long time ago, planned by God. This is a part of God's purpose. So that's part of it. That's one of the things that makes it a little odd. But there's another thing that makes it a little odd. There are 4 women in the genealogy. Now, folks, back in that day, women were not considered to be people but property. Their names were never included in lineages. And what's more remarkable is who these women were. They're all foreigners, all of them, non-Jews, every one of them, and most of them of doubtful moral character. Ruth, she probably comes closest to getting a clean slate, but if you read the text carefully, she appears to be sexually aggressive, and she probably entrapped Boaz into marrying her. And she is not a Jew, but she's a Moabite. She belonged to an alien and hated people. Tamar, she's a deliberate seducer and adulterer. She poses as a hooker in order to sleep with and then blackmail her father-in-law Judah into keeping a promise that he had made to her. Rahab was a Canaanite living in the town of Jericho. She doesn't pretend to be a hooker, she is a hooker. And we are told that she welcomes the spies into her room. Another woman in the text is simply labeled Uriah's wife, who we know as Bathsheba. She's seduced by King David, who had her husband killed, and she's the mother of Solomon. But she is a Hittite by marriage. These are Jesus' great-great-grandmothers, and quite frankly, there aren't many parents in the room who are going to want to use these ladies as examples for their children to follow. Nobody's going to name their child Tamar or Rahab. You want to find a good female in the lineage, you ought to go back to women like Sarah and Rebecca and Leah and maybe Mary, but not these questionable ones. It's almost like Matthew is hanging toilet paper in the family tree. Once you see these names, you have to wonder why Matthew included them in Jesus' family cemetery and why he buries them so close to Jesus. You'd think he'd want them buried 50 yards away from Joseph's tomb. There's got to be a point to it, probably many points to it, but what are they? For some reason, Matthew's included him. As I said, he's a very meticulous, careful writer. William Barclay, the biblical scholar, perhaps one of the more famous ones, he thinks he knows what Matthew's trying to say. He says primarily that the barriers are being broken down. He says that the barrier between Jew and Gentile is removed because foreigners are included in the Jesus' bloodline. He says that the barrier between male and female is being taken away because Jesus has women included in his pedigree. And finally, Barclay says that the area between saint and sinner is down. God can use, for God's purposes and to fit into God's scheme of things, those who have sinned greatly. Here at the very beginning of the gospel, we get a glimpse of the all-embracing width and depth and length of the love of God. God can find God's servants even among those for whom us respectable people would probably shy away from in horror. Now, as I look at the text, one other thing pops out for me, and it's this: we do not get to pick our relatives and ancestors. I have some friends from the east side, and they have friends who are well-to-do, and they look longingly at their friends and their wealth and their resources. Now, their friends, they haven't worked any harder or they aren't any smarter necessarily. They just happen to be born in the right family. They inherited their wealth. You know, they were born on third base and they thought they had a triple kind of people, you know. And my friends look longingly at these people who are so much better off than themselves, and I just tell them, well, if you'd have picked better parents, it might be a different story for you. But of course, none of us get to pick our families. And even more to the point, every one of us has at least one family member, if not many family members, that we frankly wish weren't a part of the family. They're an embarrassment to us. We try to avoid them in public. We don't go near them at family reunions. Maybe you have some people in your family that you wouldn't consider up to the family standard. Maybe they are alcoholics, or they're addicted to drugs. Maybe they spent time in prison. Perhaps they've abandoned their families for an illicit relationship. Maybe they never have worked a day in their lives and they're a drain on the family resources. Maybe they are abusers or dropouts or fanatics or bullies, something that makes you wish they just weren't a part of the family. Maybe they're Democrats or Republicans. Look at the people in your family. If you don't have at least one black sheep in the flock, guess what, folks? You're the one. But guess what? So far as I can tell, where we come from is not nearly as important as who we are and where we're going. I could be mistaken, but I do not recall a single instance where Jesus ever refers to his ancestors. Other people do it for him. Matthew does it for him in spades because, as I mentioned, Matthew wants everybody to know that Jesus is the son of David, that he is the king. The scriptures are filled in Matthew's gospel with the word fulfillment. He wants you to understand, and that's why in Matthew's gospel, the three magi come to visit the king. You don't find shepherds in Matthew's gospel. You got to go over to Luke for that. Luke's the one that cares about the down and outers, the women and the children, not Matthew. He wants the lordship of Jesus, the connection to David to be emphasized. But I don't think Jesus ever made anything of the fact that he was a son of David. In the gospel, two men cry out to the son of David. When Jesus heals a man who cannot speak, he says, "Can this be the son of David?" When the woman of Tyre and Sidon asked Jesus for help for her daughter, she calls him the son of David, but I don't think Jesus ever once referred to himself as that way. So far as I can tell, ancestry wasn't all that important to Jesus. In fact, on one occasion, Palm Sunday, he said to his detractors that God could raise up children of Abraham out of the rocks on the ground, which was to say to his antagonists who were so very proud of where they came from, your Jewish ancestry ain't all that much. But I do know one thing. Jesus never carried his family's baggage. I remember the time his family thought that he was nuts, thought that he was demon-possessed, and they had come to take him back, steal him away to Galilee. And when he heard that his mother and brothers were outside, he said, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" And pointing to his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." Jesus' source of origin may or may not have been important, but it was not confining. He didn't carry around the family baggage. And if I can offer a word of advice to you folks who might have people in your family of questionable nature, I'd recommend you do the same. Let people carry their own baggage. The only person in the world who should be able to embarrass you is you. Now, one look at the family cemetery of Jesus, and you realize pretty quickly there are no perfect families, and as I've already said, it's not nearly as important as where you come from as to who you are now and where you're going. Your past or your family's past should not cloud your future. And then I would want you to know, that is obvious from this text, God can use the low and the high to accomplish God's purposes. God can use saint and sinner. God can use great deeds and bad deeds and weave them all together to accomplish God's purposes. God uses ordinary people, fallible people, to accomplish what God wants to accomplish in this world, as Jesus' genealogy clearly shows. Well, it's getting on in time, so I'll finish with a story. It's from my favorite teacher and preacher, Fred Craddock, who has passed away now. He and his wife Nettie were at one of their favorite vacation spots, the Great Smoky Mountains. They were at dinner at a restaurant in a little town outside Gatlinburg, a town called Cosby. It's a rather new restaurant at the time. It was the Black Bear Inn, an attractive place, had an excellent view of the mountains. And early in the meal, an elderly man approached them. He looked like he might work at the place, and he said, "Good evening." And Fred said, "Good evening." And the man said, "Are you on vacation?" And Fred said, "Yes," but under his breath he's saying, "It's really none of your business, But the man pressed on. He said, "Where are you from?" And Fred said, "Well, we're from Oklahoma." And he said, "What do you do in Oklahoma?" And under his breath, but almost audible, Fred is saying, "Leave us alone. We're on vacation. We don't know who you are." But Fred said, "I'm a Christian minister." And the man said, "What church?" And Fred said, "The Christian church." And then the fellow paused for a moment and he said, I owe a great deal to a minister of the Christian church. And then he went over and he took a chair from another table and he pulled it over to their table and he sat down. And Fred said, oh, yes, please sit down. But under his breath, you knew he was saying, just leave us alone. We don't know who you are. The man said, I grew up in these mountains. My mother was not married, and the whole community knew it. I was what they called an illegitimate child. In those days, it was a shame, and I was ashamed. The reproach that fell on her fell also on me. When I went to town, I could see people staring at me, making guesses as to who was my father. At the school, children said ugly things to me, and so I stayed by myself during recess, and I ate my lunch alone. In my early teens, I began to attend a little church back in the mountains called Laurel Springs Christian Church. It had a minister who was both attractive and frightening, he said. He had a chiseled face and a heavy beard and a deep voice. I went to hear him preach. I don't know why exactly, he said. It just did something for me. However, I was afraid that I wasn't welcome since I was, as they put it, a bastard. So I'd go just in time for the sermon, and when it was over, I would move out because I was afraid somebody would say, what's a boy like you doing in church? Well, one Sunday, people queued up in the aisle before I could get out, and I was stopped. And before I could make my way through the group, I felt a hand on my shoulder, a heavy hand. It was the minister. I cut my eyes around. Had caught a glimpse of his beard and his chin, and I knew who it was. I trembled in fear. He turned his face around so he could see mine, and he seemed to be staring at me a little while. I knew what he was doing. He was going to make a guess as to who my father was. And a moment later, he said, well, boy, he said, I can see you're a child of, and he paused right there. And I knew it was coming. I knew I would get my feelings hurt. I knew I would never go back again. And he said, boy, you are a child of God. I can see the striking resemblance, boy. And then he patted me on the back and he said, now you go out and you claim your inheritance. He said, I left that building a different person. He said, in fact, it was really the beginning of my life. And Fred, he was caught up in the story like I'm caught up in the story. He was so moved by it. He asked him, he said, well, what's your name? And he said, Ben Hooper. And Fred recalled, though very vaguely, his own father talking about when Fred was a child, how the people of Tennessee had twice elected a governor, an illegitimate child by the name of Ben Hooper. You know, for a long time, I wondered, why would Matthew hang toilet paper in the family tree of Jesus? How embarrassing for Jesus, but it's not that. I should have known better. Because, you see, I was a youth minister for 5 years. I know what toilet papering is all about. I'm a professional at this. You do not toilet paper the houses of people you don't like. You toilet paper the houses of people you do like, the people you love, the people you want to honor, the people you want to congratulate, the people you want them to know that they're part of the family. If you don't like somebody, you egg their house. But if you love them, you toilet paper. And the toilet paper in the trees of Jesus is a sign of God's love. You take a stroll through the cemetery and you see these family. It's a mixed bag there. God takes all these bits and pieces, the good, the bad, the high, the low, the noble and the base, all to bring about the fulfillment of God's purposes. And I, for one, take hope. It is the beginning. In the beginning, it's a new Genesis, if you will. Can you feel God's hand on your shoulder this morning? And he's turned you around and he looks you in the eye and he says, you are a child of God. Do not let anything or anyone in your past or your present keep you from your destiny. Your past, your family's past, nothing should stand in the way of what God desires for you. That's what Advent and Christmas is all about. It's about God coming into the world as a child, a son of David, and saying, in Christ, you can begin again. Amen.